So welcome to lecture number 106 on the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim. The page numbers I will be saying is from the volume 2 of the Shlomo Pinas edition, and we are on a page 486 about to study chapter 22 of part 3 of the Moreh Nevuchim. And in this section, the Rambam is addressing the important issue of theodicy and providence. So some of the most thorny, difficult, challenging aspects of how God interacts or doesn't interact, or depending on how you look at it, with the world that we live in, and how we experience God's providence, and so on. So there's a couple introductions that are in order before we do chapter 22. And if you remember, just a quick review, in the last two chapters, the Rambam emphasized the nature of God's knowledge, and that the nature of God's knowledge is something that we can't relate to, we can't understand, we can't describe. Whatever his knowledge is, it's completely unified. It's one, right? God's knowledge and God's essence are not two different things, because then there would be two aspects to God, which would be blasphemous in Maimonidean theology. So in the same way that, when God knows everything, he knows it all as one thing. So it's impossible to state. So the questions that we have about God's knowledge, how could it be that he knows something and we still have free choice, which is one of the most basic theological questions that people debate and twist their brains around all the time, is not a question. It's only a question based on our knowledge. We have knowledge, we assume that we know things, and we make deductions, and then we say, well, then how could God know, and so on. But jumping from our knowledge and they're asking questions about God's knowledge makes no sense, because his knowledge is completely different than ours. In fact, we shouldn't even use the term knowledge. It's just we don't have a term to use, so we use knowledge. But it has nothing to do with God. That was what he emphasized before. So one of the key questions that the Rambam, that every theologian has to deal with, is the question of theodicy, and that is that why doesn't the world conform to the sense of justice that you and I imagine that the world should conform to, if God is truly good and truly just, right? When we see someone getting away with evil and prospering despite being evil, or maybe even because they're evil in many cases, or we see someone who we know to be a righteous or just person, or we know ourselves, we feel and we know in our own mind or heart that we don't deserve X, Y, Z, whatever it was that we're suffering from. So we then ask questions about God, and then we try to find answers, right? And whatever answers we find could lead us in all sorts of philosophical directions. So the question of theodicy is, of course, dealt with in most detail in one of the, I mean, I shouldn't say most important books of the Tanakh, because obviously each one is most important in its own right. But the Sefer Eov, the book of Eov. So the Rambam is going to, of course, address in these next two chapters the Sefer Eov. Now, I'm not sure how many of you might have studied Eov, and you might be familiar with it. Some of you might not be. I very, very, very highly recommend that you take the time to study Eov. If you want to learn about Jewish philosophy, learn what Tanakh has to say about the issue of theodicy. Really, if you don't have the time or ability to open up the book and read it for yourself, or choose as numerous books about it, then listen to my podcasts on Let the Prophet Speak. And I'm not just making a plug for myself. I'm telling you, because it will, if it's not a part and parcel of your heart and the way you approach God and Judaism and everything, then it has to be, and you're missing something serious in your life. So I highly recommend studying Eov. Don't be afraid of it. It will dramatically change a lot about what you might have thought Jewish theology taught. But this is an actual book of the Bible, so read it. Anyway, so Bible doesn't need my endorsement, but I'm endorsing it, right? So please do that. And it is a little bit of a plug for myself, but because you can listen to my podcasts. It took me a year to prepare those podcasts on it, and it was extremely rewarding. Anyway, but just let me give a quick summary of the book of Eov. And then I'm going to give another quick summary of the Rambam's cognitive model, which has come back at a lot. And understanding both of those is crucial to understanding these next two chapters. So a very, very, very fast summary of the book of Eov is as follows. You had this guy named Eov, right? Or Job in English. Okay, I'm going to call him Eov by his Hebrew name from now on. So you had this guy named Eov, and he was a very righteous man. He was good, and by all accounts, and God loved his behavior. Eov was wonderful. He would visit the temple or bring sacrifices to God, and he was charitable. He was honest. He was just. And Eov was very prosperous. He was very wealthy. He had a lot of animals. He had children. His children every night would get together and eat together, and they were all friendly. Everything is wonderful. And God was one day sitting upstairs in heaven, debating, talking with his group of people up there, his group of angels or whatever. And he tells them, "Hey, everybody, look at my Eov. He's such a wonderful guy. Look at our Eov. He's great. Look, Eov is such a tzaddik. He's so perfect." And then Satan came in, right? The Satan came, and he was wandering around earth. Everyone else was sitting up with God, but Satan was, he was wandering around earth. He comes in and he says to God, of course he's good. He has everything. He's rich. He's wealthy. He has kids. He's healthy. He's looked up to. Of course he's good. Give him to me. Let me make him suffer a little bit, and then we'll see how good he is. Next thing you know, he's going to be blaspheming you, God, and he's not going to be so great. So Eov, so God tells Eov, you can do whatever you want. I mean, God tells the Satan, you can do whatever you want to him, just don't hurt him personally. So the Satan causes enemies to come and attack him and steal his things, the storms to come and destroy his houses, and his houses were destroyed. It killed his children. He lost everything he owned, his entire family. It's just him, and that's it is left. And Eov still accepts God's judgment. And then Satan comes back to God, and God says, "See, look." And then God said, I need to make him suffer, because people can suffer sometimes, all kinds of tragedy. But if you make them hurt, so God says, you know what? You can go make him suffer. Just don't kill him. You have to keep him alive. So the Satan makes him ill and covered with boils and lying in the dirt, suffering and illness. Eov's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come and visit him, and they to comfort him while he's sick. And then the next 40 chapters, what I just told you was the first two. The next 40 chapters is a discussion between the three friends and Eov, them arguing with him over, and essentially, and the Rambam is going to go through this in the next chapter, 23, each one of the friends and where they came from, where they were looking, and what Eov's thing was. So Eov, of course, knew that he was innocent, and we, the audience of the book, right? We know that Eov is innocent. We know that he's suffering and he didn't deserve it, because we heard God himself say that he didn't deserve it, right? Right? So we have the best possible witness telling us that Eov does not deserve the suffering, but nonetheless, he's getting it, right? So you hear the process where the friends are telling Eov, you must have done something wrong. You must have been guilty of something. God is just. You have to repent from whatever it is. And then they start pointing out things that they think he did wrong. And Eov insists the entire time, I know I'm innocent. I know I don't deserve this. And he insists that he should, if he can only stand before God and defend himself, he would be right. And God would admit that he didn't deserve all the suffering. And this goes on and on and on until a fourth friend named Elihu comes in, and he states, and we're going to get in chapter 23 a little more, and he gets a little bit more down to earth. He berates the friends for not being such great comforters, and he says, and he kind of starts to touch on theodicy in a more sophisticated way, of us not understanding God's ways, etc., and so on, and using this as an opportunity for growth, even if you don't understand it, and things like that. And then at the end, the last several chapters, God himself comes and says to Eov, and talks to Eov and gives him the answer, which is, of course, a non-answer, right? It's several chapters. God just basically describes how much a human being doesn't know about the universe, even about the things that that are here, but especially about the things that are beyond our capacity to understand. and so on. And then in the end of the story, Eov recognizes and says, you have now given me knowledge, right? Eov was begging God for knowledge. If I only understood what's going on. So the key thing is knowledge, and you'll see why that's important in Rambam's discussion. His understanding is what Eov was asking for, and in the end, he got understanding. Not understanding of why he suffered. God never told him, you suffered because Satan decided to smack you, right? God just told him, you don't, it's knowledge beyond what you're capable of understanding. And then at the end of the book, Eov, regains his health, and eventually he remarries, and he has more children, and he becomes wealthy again, and everything is all hunky dory. But obviously, the background is it's not so hunky dory, because the bottom line is he suffered terribly, and his children died, and so on, and so much suffering. Why? It's an answer which we never really have. I very, very briefly summarized the book of about 45 chapters, give or take a few. Maybe I don't know the exact number, something like that. So it's important. I gave this summary because in order to understand the Rambam that we're about to learn, you need to know the book of Eov. And there's one more thing I want to mention as an introduction before we learn chapter 22. For those that joined recently, I saw Jack. We're on page 486 of volume 2 of the Pines edition, about to start chapter 22 of part 3 of the Moreh Nevuchim. So the second introduction I want to give is a reminder to those that have been with me for a while. And that is the cognitive model, Rambam's the Maimonidean cognitive model, and that is that the Rambam looks at the human psyche as being really divided into two parts. There's the imaginative faculty and the rational faculty, right? The imaginative faculty is based on matter, right? This is the Aristotelian idea between matter and form. Matter is the stuff, the physical stuff of which we're made of, right? And that matter, within it is the imaginative faculty, is our brain, within which bounces around all the neurons. Of course, I know I just threw in modern terminology, but the idea being it's taking place in the stuff, in the matter of us. The rational faculty is the part of us which comes as an emanation over time and place, an emanation from God all the way through the spheres, all the way down to us, through the active, what he calls the active intellect, which allows us to discern truth. Now, this is an important point. I use the word truth as opposed to using the word good, because according to Rambam, and this has been consistent throughout, and it's going to be very consistent in these coming chapters, that in the Rambam's philosophy, truth and good is the same thing, right? The way we discern what's good and what's right is by truth. God is good because God is truth. Good is things that are true, okay? So by study, by learning, by understanding, by seeking knowledge, we gain truth, right? That's how we learn how. And by doing that, we also gain an understanding of what is good, right? So by the very definition, what is true is good. So when we gain, and the idea of the goal of a human being is for his rational faculty to rule over the imaginative faculty, to take the imaginative faculty and use it for good. The imaginative faculty, that which is based in matter, is something which is often is usually drawn towards physical things, towards selfish things, not things that are true or good, but things that are designed to satisfy the base desires of that matter, right? So the lust after sexual things, or lust after food, or lust that you want to be lazy, you want to cheat, you want to things that so the rational faculty is capable of controlling that and saying, let me think about it. Is this the right thing to do, or is it not the right thing to do? So you can, the ultimate perfect person, the one who achieves the level of the best, the highest kind of prophet, right, is the one. And we learned this in the Rambam when we learned how he understands what prophecy is when a person has so much control over his imaginative faculty. His rational faculty now has achieved complete master of the imaginative faculty. And now he can use the great skills that his imaginative faculty has, the imagination, the images, the dreams and ideas that comes from matter, right? He's able to control them and use them to bring people closer to truth, bring himself or herself closer to truth. So that was the cognitive model. We've been through this before for those that have been with us, but it's very important to understand that in order to understand chapter 22. I know that took a while. Now I see we're probably not going to get through chapter 22 tonight, but we're going to get through some of it. So let's begin. Okay, so first of all, excuse me, the story of Eov. And by the way, Rambam has quoted from Eov numerous times throughout the book. It's clearly one of his favorite books of Tanakh. And I truly believe that it is an awful tragedy that so many people, I personally went through Yeshiva through years and years and years of Yeshiva and never touched the book of Eov until I was much older. And I thought, what is this book in Tanakh that I never really learned, And having studied it, it was just an incredible eye opener. It's just a shame that people don't learn it more. But here we go. The story of Eov, which is extraordinary and marvelous, belongs to the kind of things we are discussing now. I mean to say that it is a parable intended to set forth the opinions of people concerning providence. When you learn Eov, you learn what providence means. Remember, you learn how God controls the world, right? Providence means that when I go outside and I get a stone falls off a tree or something and hits me on the head, I think, oh, God did that to me. That's a person that has that kind of view of providence. That God running all these things, that's providence. But the book of Eov is teaching us about providence. The explicit statement of some of the stages. So first of all, Rambam has to lay down a few things that are important. Right? Number one, you have to know the explicit statement of many of Chazal, right? And this is in Bava Batra, where they have this argument, Eov lo haya v'lo nivra. Eov never existed and was never created, and it was just a mashal, it's just a parable. So the entire story about the Satan and God sitting up there and bragging about Eov, and all of that is simply, completely a mashal. And not only that, the entire story is just a mashal. It's a parable. There was never a guy named Eov, and there was never a story that happened like this. The whole story is simply meant as a parable to teach us lessons. Those, on the other hand, who believe that he has existed and was created, but then there are some that say, no, there was a guy named Eov, right? And he was a great guy, and he did go through a lot of suffering. All these things happened. His friends did visit him and so on, right? However, they do not know at what time and what place he lived. They argue over whether or not he lived in this time. For some of the sages say he lived in the days of the Avot and the patriarchs. Others say that he lived in the days of Moshe. Others say that he lived in the days of David. Others say that he lived in the days of the Shuvei Tzion, the ones that came back from Babylon to build the second temple. Right? So this confirms the opinion of those who say that he has not existed and was not created. The very fact that there's so many arguments as to when he lived clearly demonstrates that the one who said that he never actually existed was right? Because if he was a historical figure, we would know when he lived, right? But because he wasn't an actual historical figure, everyone could come up with all kinds of ideas as to when he might have lived, because he never actually did live, right? This confirms the opinions of those who say, okay, I just said that. To sum up, whether he existed or not, right? There were people that think that he existed, but whether he did or not, the bottom line is, right? With regard to cases like his, which always exist, all reflecting people complex. It doesn't matter if he actually existed or not, because his story is familiar to all of us. Every single one of us either have lived through suffering that we cannot attribute to our action. We may have suffered something that even honest self-reflection cannot find a personality flaw in ourselves that would make us deserving of that suffering. Or, right, we know other people. We've seen people go through terrible suffering. We can't imagine what kind of sin that person could possibly have committed to deserve that kind of suffering. So the question that, especially after, things like the Holocaust or October 7th, when you look at things like that, you can't possibly describe to me a reason why any human being should be put through that kind of suffering. There's no. So the questions that Eov was asking are questions that are timeless, regardless of whether or not he existed. So the Rambam is saying is that it doesn't matter if he was real or not. The bottom line is the question is real and the experience is real, right? All reflecting people will become perplexed and we wonder, right? And in consequence, such things as I have already mentioned to you are said about God's knowledge and his providence. Because of our perplexion over these matters, we end up making conclusions similar to the conclusions that many of the other philosophers made that we discussed in previous chapters. They say, well, either God doesn't care, or God doesn't know, or God, or God only cares about the general things, not the specific things, or people come up with all kinds of explanations. Or God is not just, or God is punishing you now so that you can get rewarded later, or maybe all kinds of answers. And the Rambam didn't use this answer, but the Kabbalistic answer of you're suffering now for what you did in the previous life, all of those things were things that Rambam would consider utter nonsense. But the reason why people say those things is because of this perplexion. Why, right? We don't understand why. How could these things happen? I referred to the assertion that a righteous and perfect man who is just in his actions and is most careful to avoid sins was stricken without his having committed a sin entailing this by great and consecutive calamities with respect to his fortune, his children, and his body. We've unfortunately all seen it, and if we haven't seen it in our own lives, we're aware of it happening. If we open our eyes and pay attention to the world around us, we see it all the time. So the question remains, and the question of Eov is as real can be. And this is actually it teaches us a tremendous lesson about the truth of Torah in general. The Rambam very often resorts to saying this in this story is a parable, right? And when it's important to understand that he means the same thing he means here. He doesn't mean that it's not true. He means that it's true in a very different way, right? It's a parable. In other words, whether or not this actual person existed and this actual thing happened on this actual day is really not relevant. What's relevant is the story and the lessons being taught by that story. And that's how the Rambam approaches the book of Eov. Now, according to both opinions, the one that considers that he has existed and the one that considers he has not, right? However, regardless of which opinion in the Gemara and Bava Batra you go with, whether he existed, but he existed in this time of history or that time of history, or he never existed at all, everyone agrees that the prologue, the discourse of Satan and God addressing Satan and the giving over of Eov to Satan's whims, right, is indubitably, in the view of everyone endowed with intellect, a parable. Anyone that thinks that that's real, that God actually gave Satan permission, that whole story is an actual real thing that happened, right, clearly doesn't have an intellect. I cannot possibly tell you how many times I've had discussions with people who like looked at me like I was a heretic when I said the Bible says. You can go out into the street today and tell somebody that the Rambam doesn't believe that there's an actual being called Satan. And they're going to tell you, but the Bible says, look, in Job, right? Well, the Rambam just said that if you have an intellect, you'll understand that it's all a parable, right? And he's going to tell us in a minute what this means, who Satan is, what Satan is, right? Judaism, at least according to Rambam, does not believe that there's such a being. And he'll tell you, and we'll see in a minute what he means. However, it is not a parable like all others. It's not just a random story. La-di-da-di-da, the fox and the hen or whatever. But one to which extraordinary notions and things that are of the mysteries of the universe are attached. This story in Eov is profoundly deep and has profound lessons to be learned from it. And the Rambam is going to give us a few little keys so that when you should make a decision to yourself to go and study it. When you study it, you'll take those keys and you'll learn things about the world and about God's providence that are profound and deep and important. Through it, great enigmas are solved. A lot of things that you may not have understood, you'll understand. And truths, right, than which none is higher become clear. The highest levels of truth you could learn through the book of Eov. I shall mention to you what is possible to mention. In other words, Rambam in his usual manner. I'm not going to sit now and explain all 52, or I can't remember exactly, 45, I don't know, in the 40s chapters of Eov, right? But I shall mention to you the words of the sages. And Rambam here wants to ground himself in Chazal because he understands that some people are going to object to some of the things that he says. They're going to think that it's somewhat on the edge of philosophically acceptable for a Jewish rabbi to be saying. But the Rambam tightly grounds his understanding of Eov with statements from Chazal, from the rabbis, in order to make sure you understand that what he's saying he believes is 100% mainstream rabbinic Judaism. And I shall mention to you the words of the sages that have drawn my attention to everything that I understand in this great parable. Okay, so I'm going to bring Chazal. That's what the Rambam says. So now that we have that introduction, remember it's a parable remember that it never really happened. And if you think there's a guy named Eo, fine. So there's a guy named Eo. But the whole story about the Satan and the heaven, that it's just a parable to teach us lessons. Okay. The first thing that you will consider is its dictum, is the following statement. And it starts off the Eov, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz, Ayin Vav Tzadi. Now, here it's transliterated as U and a hard Z. I don't know what there's some name for that letter, whatever that is. But the the usual translation actually is Oz, right? In the land of Oz. This is where, for those that are fans of the famous musical Oz, this is where Oz comes from. It was in the land of Oz, okay? But what does Utz mean in Hebrew? So Ayin Tzadi, the Rambam says, in which figures the equivocal word Utz. Equivocal in the Rambam means that it means different things in different places, right? Right? It means one thing, but sometimes the meaning is borrowed for something else. Why the land of Utz? If it's a parable and there is no actual place called Oz, right? Or Utz, right? So then why use that word, right? There must be a meaning in choosing that word. And the Rambam is telling you there's a very deep meaning. First of all, Utz is the name of individual. We have Utz Bechoro. There's a name of an Utz in the Torah, but it is also the imperative of a verb. It is part of a verb, which means to reflect and to meditate, to think. Utz is from the Hebrew word etza, right? To ask advice, right? To think, right? Or li'a'etz is to give advice or to give counsel to someone. So Utz means right? Utzu etza, right? Counsel, take counsel together. It is as if the scripture, right? The Navi, or the writer of Eov, is telling you, meditate and reflect on this parable. Eov comes from the land of Utz. Think about it. So the Rambam is telling you the first key thing. And remember the Rambam's cognitive model, right? Thinking logically and reasonably and philosophically about an issue is the process that we're supposed to go through our lives. That's how we're supposed to run our lives. We need to think about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And we need to think, when we read this book, we need to think about the lessons that it's teaching us. Utz is the key to the book. Use your head, right? And then you will understand what it's learning. Grasp its meaning. Meditate, reflect on this parable, grasp its meaning, and see what the true opinion is. And there you can come to truth, right? How do you come to truth? Read this book and think about it. Then afterwards, it mentions the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, right? It says that the Bnei Elohim, like the sons of God, usually translated as the angels, came before God, as if there was like a daily briefing, that the angels come before God and they sit around and God presents the issues of the day and they discuss them and come to a vote and they make resolutions. That's how it's presented. That's how the story is presented, right? So the thing is though, and then it says that the Satan came in the midst of their crowd and multitude. For it does not say the sons of God and Satan came to present themselves before the Lord, right? Which would have sounded like there's angels, there's angel A, there's angel B, there's angel C, and there's Satan, who's angel D, and there's Joe Schmo, who's angel E, and so on and so forth. Satan wasn't one of the angels. He's presented as something else. Now remember, what do angels mean in Rambam's philosophy? Rambam has told us many times. Angels are in the Rambam's philosophy, are the forces of nature through which God runs this world, right? The Rambam talked about the forces that move the spheres around, which would be an Aristotelian equivalent today, right? The energy that makes the atomic particles move. That's what Rambam would call an angel, right? The forces of nature that make things happen, right? He understood it in Aristotelian ways. We understand it in ways closer to modern physics. But so the angels are actual things. They're actual forces through which God runs this world. Satan is not one of those. And this is very important. There is no such force of evil. Remember, Rambam told us evil is the lack of good. Evil is when we take our rational intellect away and allow that imaginative intellect, the imaginary faculty, which is based on matter and the selfish desires of matter. That is what evil results from. right? So evil results from a lack of intellect, a lack of thinking, a lack of education, a lack of logic, a lack of truth. That's the bottom line, because all those things that I mentioned lead to truth. So Satan is not one of those things. Satan is not one of those angels that's sitting up there. I know I'm carrying Rambam's words a little farther than he says in this line, but as we read through it, you'll see I'm not making this up. This is all coming from the Rambam's words. Okay? So, for which would have, had it said the sons of God and Satan sat together, which would have meant that all of them were there because of identical relation, that they're all the same, they're all angels. So then it would mean there's this angel that's in charge of making the sun go around, and this angel is in charge of the moon, and this angel is in charge of happiness, and this angel is in charge of evil, right? But that's not what's happening, right? So but it says, no, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. He was a separate thing, right? So remember, Satan is not a force of nature, but Satan is something else. There is no evil force in the world. Remember, he's saying this because very strongly, because a lot of belief systems have Satan as some sort of evil force. The Rambam is emphatically telling us that he's not. All right. This form of speech is only used with regard to one who has come without having been for his own sake the object of an intention, or having been sought for his own sake. Nobody invited him. He's not a member of the committee, right? He just happened to be there, but he wasn't invited. He wasn't wanted. He's not one of the committee members that God uses to govern the world, so to speak, right? In this parable that we're trying to draw. But rather he came in the midst of those who came when those whose presence was the object of intention presented themselves. So God's counsel, so to speak, are those through which God acts in this world. And we've learned those are the angels, because God uses those angels. Remember, the word, when we use the term angels, it's so ingrained in our mind to come up with images of white women flying around with feathered wings, and that we keep thinking of. That's not what angels means, right? Angels, according to Rambam, means forces of nature, right? So you can understand the parable is that God was sitting with his council, right? In other words, running the world, doing what he does every day, right? Making the world go around, right? And then there was this Satan guy, right? The Satan, and we're going to say and focus a little more on who it is, right? Then it mentions immediately that this Satan, whatever the Satan is, he was different than the other ones, because he roamed and went all over the world. He was lashut, like shin vav tet, right? Which is a play on the word Satan, shin tet nun, right? This Satan was which means to wander around. So Satan's job was, he was just wandering around the world, being in the world, right? Not like these other forces, but he was just everywhere. He was just everywhere in the world, in the planet of matter that you and I live on, right? And so he went and roamed all over the earth. Thus, there is no relationship whatever between him and the upper world. He's not one of those forces of nature like those other things are, right? But he's something else in which there is no road for him, right? There's no place for him to bounce around up there, right? Because he bounces around within this world of matter. He doesn't bounce around up there in the heaven. But he happened to wander into this meeting, right? This is the meaning of the saying, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it, because that's what the Satan was doing. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Thus, his going to and fro and his roaming take place on the earth. That's where Satan roams around. All right. Then it mentions, okay, so now we set up the scene, right? We have God, we have all of the forces of nature, which are represented by these angels sitting around the room. And we have this earthly power that's deeply embedded on this planet, right? In matter, that usually bounces around. The only place where there's roads for him to go are on this earth, right? In your house and in my house and outside in the street and maybe in other houses in the world, the White House or other places, but they bounce around in those kinds of places, right? That's where this force, right, wherever the physical matter is bouncing around. Then it mentions that this righteous and perfect man was delivered into the hands of the Satan. So remember, we went through that story, right? God bragged about Eo And then Satan said, let me handle him and he won't be so great anymore, right? And that all the calamities that befell him with respect to his fortune, his children, and his body were caused by Satan. And it gives its idea that it was caused by Satan. Now that we have a different understanding of who Satan is, right? So we can start understanding a little bit of what it means that all of these calamities happen. If you look at the calamities carefully, right, they all are results of the forces of nature, right? Either in the first one case where the enemies came, like bands of bandits came and stole all of his things. You have to read the story, right? Enemies came and attacked his workers and and so on. Storms came and knocked over his building, right, and his things, which killed his children, right? I remember Rambam said, who built those buildings? Did they have in mind there might be a storm? Did they build them strong enough? Remember, Rambam said, as a result of actions in this world, these sufferings happen. And not to take, they're obviously awful, terrible suffering. I'm not pointing a finger, but what I'm saying is that the results of the usual ways of matter happening in this world, through the result of those things, all of this happened. In other words, it was this worldly stuff that occurred that ended up in Eob's suffering. In other words, it came from Satan. Thus, it mentions a certain opinion and ascribes it to Eob. I'm sorry, I skipped the sentence. After having made this supposition, right? After, in other words, telling us that Satan was the one that caused this, it begins to set down speeches of people engaged in speculation with regard to this occurrence. So then Eob's friends and Eob have this long-running debate for like 38 chapters, I think. I might be off by one or two, of them debating back and forth what's going on, right? All of them assumed, okay, that it was God doing this, right? When remember, it's not God doing this, it's the lack of God doing this. It's the lack of striving for truth that makes the suffering happen, right? It's the lack of study, of control of our human nature, of thinking how I should live and how I should act, right? Whether on the part of the enemies and the attackers or on the part of Eob and his children themselves. Again, not to point a finger or blame anyone, but to say that, as Rambam said, everything can somehow be attributed, right, in the end, to the forces of nature. So it was not God doing it, but it was the lack of God that allowed these things to happen. It was Satan, because that's what Satan is, right? When there's no God, when there's no truth, because those are the same thing. Thus, it mentions a certain opinion and ascribes it to Eob. As it goes on, and Rambam is going to summarize because he's going to go into more detail in the next chapter. Eob gives his opinion and it's ascribed to him, and ascribes other opinions to his friends. I shall make them clearly known to you. In other words, in the next chapter. So we're going to go into more detail of what all of their arguments are. I'm referring to those opinions about which there has been a conflict of thoughts and that are concerned with the story, the cause of the whole of which was Satan, though all of them, Eob and his friends, thought that God had done it himself and not through the intermediary of Satan. They were making the mistake of a simple-minded view of providence. And I really want you to go and look at Eob, because this is such a powerful idea. A simple-minded view of providence. Someone who thinks that God does this and God does that and God does this and God does that. On that kind of level, and thinks God does this because I deserved it, God does that because I deserved it, you end up with a really, really messed up view of what's just. Because then you go, so how do you explain the baby that, God forbid, is born with a congenital disease, right? How do you explain a Holocaust victim who never did anything wrong? How do you explain even a person who might not be perfect, who goes through horrific suffering with horrible diseases and so on, or gets captured as a POW in Vietnam or something? How do you explain such things, right? You can't explain them with a simple-minded view of providence, because a simple-minded view of providence thinks that, you get what you deserve. And therefore, and how do you explain how that guy who we all know is a cheat, a liar, a narcissist, and he's sitting in a mansion somewhere in the Bahamas, with the 6 yachts and whatever, right? You can't explain it that way. So a simple-minded view of providence is what led to those questions, right? So, but none of them realize that it's not really God doing it, but it's really being done by Satan, by the entity which we described before. The most marvelous and extraordinary thing about the story is the fact, and here's the key, that knowledge is not attributed in it to Eov. Eov was never described as a smart person or a knowledgeable person or a Torah scholar for that matter, right? Eov was described as a righteous person who lived right, right? And you see, as if you study Eov, you'll see that Eov, in the end, as time goes on, starts to beg for knowledge. And at the end of the book, he achieves knowledge. But in the beginning, that's what he lacked. He lacked knowledge. He lacked understanding, which led him to many of the questions that he brings up in the speeches that he gives. He is not said to be a wise or comprehending or an intelligent man. Only moral virtue and righteousness in action are ascribed to him. And this doesn't mean Rambam is not trying to knock moral virtue and righteousness. That's fine, right? The problem is that you can be morally virtuous and righteous, but still have a deeply flawed understanding of how the world works and how God interacts with the world. So if he had been wise, his situation would not have been obscure to him, as will become clear. Had Eov had das, had he had knowledge, then he would not have had the questions that he had. He would not have presented his question to God and said, I want to have a court case. This is one of the things Eov says in front of God. I can prove that I'm innocent and I didn't deserve this. Well, think for a moment. If you have intelligence and you understand that that's not how God's providence works, right? That what you and I think we deserve or don't deserve is not what God decides to do or not to do. That's just not how it works. I might think I deserve all kinds of things, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get them, right? And maybe, according to the logic of a human being, maybe I do deserve those things, right? Still doesn't mean I'm going to get them, right? Why does God decide to or not to give them to me? I don't know, right? But knowing that is itself intelligence, is knowledge, is wisdom. And that's the wisdom that Eov lacked, but he achieved by the end of the book. So then it graduates. We have a little bit more. There's so much here. I was hoping to do the whole chapter, but now I see there's just no way in a million years we could do the whole chapter tonight. But we could do a little bit more. I'm at the bottom of 487 now. So now, then it graduates his misfortunes according to the various circumstances of people. So the misfortunes that fell upon Eov were successive, right? For some people are not frightened by the loss of their fortune and hold it a small thing. Some people can handle going bankrupt, you know. I mean, if it's terrible, it's awful, right? And it's depressing and sad and difficult and challenging and so on. But there are people that can weather that storm. They can make do with less. They can figure out a way to get through. You know, find another job, do something, make it work, you know, and still walk out, you know, righteous and just and so on. But even such people that may be horrified by the death of their children and die because of their grief. But if God forbid something would happen to their family, you know, that's something that a lot of people, you know, that would knock them out. If anything, it may even kill them from grief, right? But others support with patience and without terror even the loss of their children. But then, you know, we see, you know, it's as awful and as horrible as such a terrible tragedy is, there are people that survive that. They go through the loss of their children and they do survive. They do make it through. They do maintain afterwards productive lives and they somehow manage to get through with a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenge, but they somehow manage. But no one endowed with sensation, if anyone has sensation, can support pain patiently. But when they personally are in physical pain, that's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to endure without starting to question God, to question, you know, and remaining righteous, right? So now all men, I mean the vulgar, glorify God with their tongues and attribute to him justice and beneficence when they are happy and prosperous, or even when they are in a state of endurable suffering, right? Everybody loves to say, God is great. He saved me from this and this tragedy. Oh, God is great. Everybody loves to talk about God is wonderful because, and they'll tell you a story about how this and this happened. So God is wonderful. Everyone can do that. That's easy. That's easy stuff. It's so easy to be faithful to God when everything is cool and hunky-dory. Or even when you're suffering a little bit and you can still get up a speech and say, yeah, I went through this, I went through that, it was bad, it was terrible, but look, I persevered, I made it through. Thank you, God, for helping me get through all that trouble, right? People do that too all the time, right? That's easy. That doesn't mean that you're anything special. Everybody can do that. However, when the misfortunes mentioned in Eov befall them, some of them become unbelievers, right? But if somebody goes through what happened to Eov, many people will become unbelievers, right? And believe that there is little order in all that exists at the time when they lose their fortune, right? They'll think to themselves, there is no justice, there is no God, there is no reason, there is no purpose to this all. It's all just random, right? And others hold to the belief in justice and order in spite even of their having been stricken by the loss of their fortunes, but do not keep patient if tried by the loss of their children. Others again are patient and keep untroubled belief even when they lose their children. But none of them supports patiently the pain of the body without complaining and repining, either with the tongue or in the heart. They may not say it, but they're definitely thinking in their heart about what's up with about thinking blasphemous thoughts, so thoughts about God, that justice does not really exist. So this is actually not a bad stopping point. There's a lot here. Again, I want to recommend again studying the book of Eov. I think it should be the most basic part of one of the basic parts of our curriculum that it should be studied more. I'm going to open the floor. We have a couple minutes. We can have questions or comments. But I think next time I'll start from the second paragraph on 488, the dictum of scripture, referring to the sons of God and so on, because I think this is a good stopping point here. Any questions? Any observations?
So was the Akedah a parable? I mean, if you use it seems like a lot of similarities,
So which parts of the Torah are parables and which ones are not, according to Rambam? It's a very good question. So there are the Akedah. No, the Rambam doesn't look at that, and he does talk about the Akedah in detail, which we're going to get to. But anything the Rambam gives us a rule. He gives us earlier in the book we studied this together, that anything in the Torah that the way we would say it in modern terms, if it makes no scientific sense at all, then it must be a parable, right? So in other words, if something is written about in the Torah, which either scientific or philosophical sense, in other words, it can't possibly be something that actually happened, right? Because it logically is inconsistent, or we know it to be, then with the exception of certain specific miracles, like Yetziat Mitzrayim or something, like a specific miracle. And the Rambam went through, we discussed this in length of what a miracle is and how it works and so on. But if something happened that is clearly not real, either because it philosophically makes no sense or because it scientifically can't be, then it must be a parable. So the three angels visiting Abraham, right, is one of the famous places. The whole story there, according to Rambam, is a parable, is a dream, right? Because it doesn't make, angels don't walk around, they don't eat. The whole story just doesn't make sense. It just can't be. I see a hand up. Does that answer your question?
No, but that's okay.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. I don't know if I'm unique. There were at least 10 points during the course of your presentation when I lost you. I don't know if that is experienced by anyone else, but I'm going to try to listen to your YouTube presentation, and I'll get back.
Was it a problem for anyone else? Could you guys three?
I could hear you fine.
The 100%? Didn't lose them any time.
No loss.
Yeah, I did notice your screen went out for a second in the middle, so I think there must have been a connection issue on your side. Martin, I see that this is bothering you.
It seems I mean, what Rambam says to me right now seems very arbitrary, and I mean the whole Akedah versus simply three men walking around, why that's impossible or unnatural, and why certain things, like why the splitting of the sea is okay, is I just don't understand it. It seems very arbitrary to me.
Yeah.
I mean,
so as a general rule, so there's there are certain specific cases where the Rambam tells us it's a parable. This is one famous one, which we just learned right today, right, with Eo. And another famous one was the three angels. But in most cases, the Rambam leaves it to us to learn, right? In this book, he doesn't go through all of Tanakh and tells us what's a parable and what's not. But he does give us that path and tell us that many of the stories that we find throughout Tanakh and through Chazal are actually parables, and he gives us guidance on how to make our way through those stories. And many of the Maimonidean style, the commentaries who follow his path will say things like that. So, like an example, for example, the story where God in Joshua, where God made the sun stand still so that they could complete the battle, right? So the Ralbag, who's known as Gersonides, who often follows a very similar path to the Rambam, right? Who he explains that story that there was no actual miracle that the sun stood still, but he explains that when in those days you couldn't really battle at night, right? And if you're winning the battle, then you want the sun to stay up as long as possible. You want the day to last as long so that you can kill as much of the enemy as you can, right? So he said they were so successful in battle that it felt like they had a long day, right? That's what it means. It seemed like the sun was up for so long because they were able to accomplish so much in that one day. So that would be a Maimonidean way of understanding that story. So the truth is that what the Rambam would say is in many of these cases, like in the example I just gave, it doesn't really matter, right, whether it actually happened, right? The lesson of the story is the same, right? Whether or not it's the point of the story is that God assisted the people to win the battle, right? Whether or not he assisted it by making the sun stand still, or he assisted by more natural means by making them win the war, right? Which you wouldn't necessarily see. I don't know. Look at the 6-Day War, a little bit more recent memory, right? In 6 days, they accomplished what most wars would have taken months to do, right? But they accomplished it in 6 days. So you have here a miracle. Did anyone see, an actual miracle? Like the angels didn't come out of the sky and seas didn't split. There was a war and a battle, and Israel won, right? But meanwhile, the idea is the same. The miracle is God working through the forces of nature. Is the forces of nature working, right? And the battle being won. So Rambam always tries to minimize. We're going. This is. I don't mind this, but this is a bit off subject from this. But the Rambam's discussion of miracle, the Rambam very minimizes. He doesn't like having God intervene in the rules of nature. That's very much not Maimonidean in philosophy. The Rambam, there's no God doesn't, like he's saying now with providence, right? That God created the world so that it runs the way it runs. Everything that happens, the Rambam said specifically, right? When the Torah says, he told us this too, when the Torah says that God made this happen, it doesn't mean that God decided on Tuesday that I'm going to make this thing happen. It means that God set up the world in such a way that all of these circumstances led to this happening, right? Because that's how it works, because God made everything, right? He made all the laws. So he knew that this was going to happen because this is how it works, right? This was what's going to happen. So he minimizes miracles. The miracles that are explicit in the Torah, like the Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea and so on, Rambam actually describes as a way of, as they were like hardwired into nature from the time of creation, right? In other words, created in the world that was created was that when these circumstances are met, the sea was going to split. So it's almost like a law of nature that the sea was going to split. It's not a law of nature that you and I see every day. We don't walk by the ocean and all of a sudden see it splitting, right? But it's hardwired into nature that way. Now, you don't have to like this, or you don't have to agree, but because there's certainly many Jewish philosophers that thought otherwise. But Nachmanides, chief among them, was very upset with a lot of these things. But this is how the Rambam understands this, it definitely for a rationalist like Maimonides, this makes it helps make sense of the Torah. It helps make sense of the lessons the Torah is trying to teach us.
So I see. Can I say something? I see
Sure.
two trends of thought and I understand both of them. One is someone who comes up through science, like Maimonides did, who has belief, but develops his feeling of what God is doing and what is happening in terms of what occurs in nature is all related to the way that God set things up in a scientific matter, including, I mean, all we can even go down to, in our day, microscopic things that occur at the cellular level and say these things are what God set up and how they set them up. And therefore, that's why we have certain diseases develop, why certain people have genetic problems and so forth and don't, because God set all of this in motion. And if you're bent in science and not just directly philosophy without science, then this all makes sense to you. And you follow what Maimonides says, and you can explain these things. For instance, what an angel is, for instance, it makes great sense if you think angels are energy, forces of energy that make things happen, and therefore they're not physical beings. And then you can explain all these things that are saying, you know, for instance, the Abraham thing where three angels visited might not be actual really what occurred. So you can explain it and feel comfortable with it. But on the other hand, if you're not a scientist and if you think in terms of philosophy of religion as being things that can occur and God does have miracles and creates miracles and things can work in contrast to a scientific model, then you feel comfortable with that and you feel uncomfortable with what we're talking about now. So, you know, it may be that Martin may lean toward the other to some degree, or many people do. And so I think that's where some of the conflict between what Maimonides is saying and what other people might believe occurs. There may just actually be two camps. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're 100% right. I mean, there's a, a lot of people write about this, and there's a lot of different terminologies that are used to describe it. But some people call it the rationalists versus mystics. That's a pretty common way of describing it today. But we have to understand that the one thing that's important, both of those trends are very important to understand, and both have its proponents in within traditional Judaism. What's crucial is to, when we study point of view A, to try to understand point of view A and not try to box it in to point of view B and say that it's saying something else. In other words, when we're learning Rambam, let's understand Rambam, right? Let's not say that Rambam said something else or that he didn't really mean it or that he could have said he should have, you know, or something like that. Let's understand Rambam for what he says. And then we can, I mean, this is something that it's probably not going to be relevant for another year at least. When we finish Rambam, we can study some of the other ones. The most important, the most important. There's so many important Jewish thinkers over time, but one of the most important ones that follows the other path, right? The less rationalistic, more mystical. And I'm using that term, even though it's not the best term, but it's just one of the ways of describing those two different camps. Is the Kuzri, is the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who wrote the Sefer Kuzari, and which is also one of the most important books in Jewish philosophy, and he takes a very, very different approach to the Rambam, a very different approach to miracles, but also a very philosophically important work, and it might be worthwhile for us to study that next. And for those of you that study Rambam with me and then study Kuzri, if that's what we choose to do next, you'll get a chance to see two very different views and very different understandings of how God interacts with this world, of what Hashgacha Pratis is, what providence is, what God's, what miracles are, what prophecy is. The very different understandings, but both extremely important and extremely influential. And I think that most of us have a little bit of both in our heart. Most of us, when we approach parts of our life, we have a little bit of both. And when we try to be too logically consistent in one direction, a little part of our heart pulls us in the other direction, and it keeps going back and forth. At least I find that to be true in myself, and of course, some of us might lean a little more in this direction or that direction, yeah, but we all have a little bit of both within us. But what's crucial is for us to understand that both of these ways of understanding God and the ways we interact with Him, um, are both have solid foundations among the Jewish philosophers, and are and are both very important ways that we ourselves, our friends, our relatives, our co-religionists, our ancestors have worshipped God through for millennia, and not just our religion. This same disagreements go into other religions as well, and it's just it's important. I mean, right now we're learning Rambam, so let's really try to get an understanding of him. If we do vote to study Kuzri next, then that's what we'll do. But at the rate we're going, need at least another year. So sometime probably near the end of 2025, Bli Neder, assuming that we're all still together and we don't get into many fights with each other, then we should be able to study the Kuzri, and you'll find it. I mean, the Kuzri doesn't need my approbation either. I'm just saying that it's important for us to see the both very similar time period. The Kuzri was written a little bit earlier than Maimonides, but there's no indication that we know of that Rambam knew of it. There's no mention of Rambam mentioning Yehuda Halevi, so it doesn't seem like they came from similar milieus, but had very, very different ways of seeing the world, and had very different lasting influences. And if you really want to know, I read a good book about that. Get yourself, a highly recommend Menachem Kellner's book called Maimonides' Confrontation with Mysticism. I might have it wrong. It might be the confrontation of Maimonides and mysticism, or something like that. Just Google Maimonides, confrontation, mysticism, and Kellner is the writer, and you can read about those two pathways and of understanding, Jewish philosophy, the Rambam versus Yehuda Halevi, and great, strongly recommended that you read that book.
Here
But
it is.
oh, you have it there?
Yeah.
Oh, so I had the name right. Okay, so I highly recommend it if you need something to read, but you won't be able to read a lot in a night, because you'll read, a half a chapter and you'll have to think about it for a week before you read the rest of the chapter. But very, very worthwhile. Nachum Kellner is probably the most prominent Maimonidean scholar in the scholarly world today. He's a professor at the University of Haifa, and he writes and lectures, and he's one of the top Maimonidean scholars today. I can't call him a friend of mine, but pen pal. We do write to each other a bunch. I send him my most pressing questions. But it's a very worthwhile book to read. All right, we're over.
So can I ask one
Of
question?
course.
So regarding Hasatan, and he's considered the entity is considered the adversary. Why is it in the Orthodox Sidurs that we pray in the morning to have protection from Hasatan if it's not a legitimate?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't be right for me to answer that question, because the Rambam is going to go next week on page 489 and in the book that we've been using. The Rambam is going to go into a lot more detail of exactly what Satan is. I gave you a preview, but he's going to go into more detail of what the Satan is. But I will answer a tiny bit and I tell you that you're asking a multi-pronged question. Because what you're asking also is, what does it mean to pray, right? Why would you pray? Why does prayer, that we be saved from the Satan, how does that do anything, right? Right? Prayer in general is a very difficult, hard subject to understand in Maimonidean philosophy, and we've discussed that many times in this class. But so how do you pray to stay away from the Satan? I mean, and I'm going to give you a little hint to the answer. The answer is the process of prayer enables you to see the truth and it helps you learn how to control those impulses that are represented by the matter part of ourselves, right? right? By praying, we understand that we're here for a reason, we're here for a purpose, we're here to serve God, we're here to worship God. So I need to control those impulses. I need to not do the things that my body wants me to do all the time, right? You know, I get jealous of somebody else and I want to steal from him, I want to rob, I want to lie, I want to cheat, I want to do all kinds of things. But my heart, but by praying, it enables us and helps us avoid those kind of influences. But that's I went ahead of myself. But we're gonna definitely study more about who Satan, who he is. He's not a who, actually. That's what the Rambam already told us today. But what it means,
Like
we're
an
gonna learn.
evil inclination. All right.
You ready?
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
That's great. Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions, issues, comments? All right. Well, we definitely went over our time, but all for good reason. And looking forward to next week to Mitzvah study again. Everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.